then we're going to look at 4 case studies that have come from using that approach. And these case studies are using our software. They've been through our training, but I really want to highlight that the work that they're doing is their work. We just build the capability of groups of people, and it's really interesting to see what they do with it. So I'll be sharing 4 case studies and then looking at some of our latest developments with regards to this work. So wicked problems, these are the kinds of problems that are wicked problems. There are things like climate change and poverty and homelessness and food insecurity and place-based disadvantage. And if you look at those problems, while they are very diverse, they've all got the same characteristics. And this is a document in 2007 that came from our then Public Service Commissioner that really looked at wicked problems and the importance of government's role in wicked problems. But the actual coining of the term wicked problems goes back to Riddle and Weber, and they are complex social policy problems. And the reason why I want to cover this today is to highlight they are social policy problems, and governments have got a really important role to play in these types of problems. If we look at those characteristics, it's easier if you look at a map like this. So this is the obesity systems map, and you can see from that map those kind of characteristics that were highlighted in that document. There's lots of underpinning causal factors, and you can see them there as those nodes. You can see all the interdependencies between those underpinning causal factors. You can imagine how different people would have a different understanding of that problem because they'd be looking at different, their focus would be different underpinning causal factors. You can get an idea of how you can have unforeseen consequences. So you could be focusing on a couple of those underpinning causal factors, and because of all those interrelationships, you could have unforeseen consequences in different parts of the problem. And you can imagine how this would be very different. A problem like this would be very different in one place, one community, compared to another. So if you were looking at something like poverty in Oxford compared to poverty in Bangladesh, it's a whole lot of different underpinning causal factors. So place is important. So I'm just going to touch on now the underpinning theories that inform my work. And I am a social entrepreneur. I'm passionate about social entrepreneurship. If you think about social entrepreneurship, you often think about social enterprises, but that's not what I'm talking about today. There's 2 systems approaches to social entrepreneurship. And the first one is the birth of social entrepreneurship. It was a systems approach. And there is a bit of like, let's reclaim the systems approach back. It doesn't have a focus on social enterprise. And this is like from over 40 years ago when Bill Drayden from Ashoka coined the term social entrepreneur. It was about creating systems change. And he talks there about not content to give a fish or teach how to fish, but wanting to revolutionize the fishing industry. And this type of social entrepreneurship, the theory, it's called the social innovation school approach. And for this kind of approach, the social entrepreneur gets a really good understanding of the system, using systems thinking types approaches, and then deciding where they want to intervene in the system, where they're going to have the greatest impact. And then they go through and they take a couple of the underpinning causal factors and treat that as a complicated problem, and therefore can do like a theory of change, and then maybe institutionalize it as a social enterprise. So that's the social innovation school approach. The complexity approach, which is the approach which underpins the work of Wicked Lab, came about 2008, 2010. There was 2 conferences at Adelphi University in New York on social entrepreneurship, systems thinking and complexity. And so there was one in 2008 and one in 2010. And then in those same years, there was 2 seminal publications, one on the right from Emergence, Complexity and Organisation, and the one on the left was in the inaugural issue of the Journal of Social Entrepreneurship. And this really set the scene for a complexity science-informed approach to social entrepreneurship. Now, this approach to social entrepreneurship doesn't go out and map all of the problem space, because it recognises that this is dynamic and changing. And so if we went out and mapped all of that by the time it finished mapping it, it would have changed. It also doesn't focus on interventions on parts of the system, like the social innovation school approach. And the reason for that is it recognises the unforeseen consequences. So if it went and focused on a couple of those underpinning causal factors, there would be unforeseen consequences from the intervention in the system. So the complexity approach to social entrepreneurship focuses on the whole problem space at once. And the focus is on shifting the state of that system from its current state to a new state, which is more coherent with the actors of the system being more coherent and more effective at addressing the actual complex problem. And so it's a transition approach. And so it's looking at, and this image here is from that second journal article, the inaugural issue of the Journal of Social Entrepreneurship. And it looks at how do you transition the system from its current state at A1 to a new state at A2, and taking it through these phases that are represented in the panel, where the new state of the system becomes the way of doing business in that community. Now, empirical research has shown that to support such transitions in communities, you've got to create conditions for doing that. So it doesn't just happen on its own. You've got to create conditions. And the social entrepreneurship field, the complexity of the social entrepreneurship complexity approach builds upon how complexity has informed leadership studies. So it's complex systems leadership theories which underpin the complexity approach to social entrepreneurship. And these are 4 of those theories. And these are the theories that underpin our work at Wicked Lab. So you've got there Lichtenstein and Plowman's Leadership of Emergence, Snowden and Boone's Tools for Managing in a Complex Context, Shuri and Hasey, and then later on Goldstein, Hasey and Lichtenstein's work on narrative leadership, and Ubi and Marion and McKelvey's work on complexity leadership theory. So those complex systems leadership theories inform the characteristics to create the conditions for these system transitions. And last year, big time for social entrepreneurs from a complexity perspective, because wicked problems and social entrepreneurship got recognised on the 2021 map of the complexity sciences. So that was a big deal for us. Now moving into the public sector space, this role of government is really important. These are complex social policy problems, and we can't forget that they are policy problems. And so it is identified that governments need to create these enabling conditions. But there's an issue. This is not the way governments like to work. They like nice, strong relationships between cause and effect, and for a variety of reasons, including the time pressures for making government policy. They want to have simplicity, repetition, clarity, accountability. There's got to be all this reporting up to ministers. So this is not the way governments like to work. So what the theory says is what needs to happen is you need to build the capacity of governments to work this way, to take a complexity approach and to support multi-level governance approaches. And to build the capacity of governments, you need to build their capacity to balance 2 roles. That's the unplanned exploration of solutions with communities without stifling communities that are doing this adaptive work. And also they've got to be able to undertake the planned exploitation of community knowledge, ideas and innovations, and take all those insights back up into their government systems and use them. So now, we've covered wicked problems. We've covered the theory underpinning this. Let's have a look at what we do at Wicked Lab. This is the PhD model. So this is like around 10 years ago, but this was the big PhD study that I did, tracking 19 community leaders for 2.5 years, and be theoretically informed as well. But the top half, that circle bit, is 5 conditions for these system transitions. So you've got these 5 focus areas, which have got these characteristics from complex systems leadership theories. So you're wanting to disrupt the system amplify action, enable self-organisation, stabilise the feedback, and enable information flows throughout that system for these transition processes. Then the bottom half is about the interface with governments. And so in government, you've got they're kind of like a mismatch of, you've got the hierarchical stuff going on, you've got the new public management stuff going on, and then you've got this dream of network governance. You've got all of that happening at the same time within these government systems. We separate out the elective government from the public administration, and both having this role of unplanned exploration and role of planned exploitation. And so there's 4 focus areas in the model that focus on that interface with government. And for the 5 focus areas for the transition process, there's characteristics there that come from those complex systems leadership theories. If we can get those characteristics into initiatives in communities that are addressing complex problems, then it helps with the transition process. And then we've got these focus areas and characteristics that assist with this interface with government systems. So that's the underpinning framework of what we use. This is a paper I wrote in the early days, which summed up the experience of taking this model as a paper-based tool and trying to work with a community to address a problem. And it was too difficult to do because there was just too much information happening. You had, for each initiative in this solution ecosystem space, you were looking if it had these 36 different characteristics. And so I guess the crunch at the end of the article is the need for a piece of software that can do that. And the software isn't magical. It's got no crazy algorithm. It's just being able to manage all of that information because it's dynamic and it's changing over time. And so Emily Humphreys, he's on the call in Australia. She'll be on Zoom there, and we actually formed the Wicked Lab, and we received a prize for the idea of turning this model into software. So I have the pleasure of working with Emily. And this is the software. This was the first feature for the software. So we've got all the initiatives down the right-hand side. You're mapping it to these 36 characteristics. Produces a whole lot of reports, including being able to map the system's transition characteristics over time, which we can use as a measure for systems change. Didn't take long to work out that we needed a training program because people thought we were a little bit crazy talking about using complexity science for addressing wicked problems. So we developed a training program, project-based learning. People were coming on to this program with a wicked problem in a place that they wanted to address using the software as they went through the training program. First unit, understanding complexity, understanding wicked problems. Second unit, focusing on the transition process. Third unit, on the interface with government. Evaluated. So you can see this scholar practitioner thing happening here. You know what I mean? It's a dance between doing the practice, writing it up, learning from a peer-reviewed journal. So this was in the the Emergence Complexity and Organisation Journal. This was the evaluation of the pilot of the training program. What we found was that we needed a lab methodology because there was this issue with people kind of guessing what characteristics initiatives have without going out and talking to people. So we had to actually develop a lab methodology. What lab methodology would be best for this? Another research project. So I looked at all the different types of lab methodologies there were, mapped them against characteristics required for addressing complex problems. And urban transition labs came really close with regards to being the best fit, but they didn't really focus on this interface with government. So therefore had to develop the systemic innovation lab approach, wrote a paper about that, published the paper about that as well, and that's in the Social Enterprise Journal. So Wicked Lab developed an elective for systemic innovation labs, its own lab methodology as well as kind of like an example of how people could do this. But even with the practice, we find that people, do their own, and some are doing FemLab's process, which is Wicked Lab's approach. Then over time, and which is really quite exciting, in the early days, we kind of like had to convince people that this was the way to go. I would say that having the peer-reviewed publications help a lot with being able to provide this peer-reviewed evidence to people, but now we don't have to do so much convincing, and so we've got a lot shorter program now. It's 3.5 days. It's an ecosystem transition program. We still find that university folk and people who have got to persuade other people do the longer program with all the theory, but this is just a case study program rather than working on your own program, and it just gets you using the software really quickly. Case studies. And as I said before, we just build capacity. These case studies are the work of the people involved in the projects, and they are just amazing. So the first one is Southwest Food Community Lab. This is being stewarded by Edith Cowan University in Western Australia and focusing on a region of Western Australia and food insecurity. This project, they've come together. You can see there the community coming together at the initial beginning of this project. This is their first transition card of when they went out and mapped how each of the initiatives, and there was over 50 initiatives in this place that were focusing on food insecurity, and how they mapped these characteristics. After they've gone through this is a systemic innovation lab. After they've gone through one cycle of this FEMLAS process, they mapped again, and they did an evaluation. It was wonderful working with universities. They did an evaluation of the process, 25 changes into the system. This evaluation, I think the bit that I found really exciting is that the different participants in this ecosystem, so that they recognise the system and they could see their role in the system, which was just an amazing feedback to come back to us. The beauty about working with universities is loads and loads of peer-reviewed publications. So no longer is it Sharon's publications that we have to try to convince people with. It's other people's publications, which is a game changer when you're trying to persuade people to do this kind of work. And so they've got a range of publications. As I said, it's one region in Western Australia. They've been able to take these publications, go into and to the Minister of Health in Western Australia to roll out this project statewide. I'm not allowed to say what the results of that are, but I'm really happy with the results. So that's yet to be announced. So it's a really good outcome. The second project is Greening Marion. This one was a state government, local government, industry partner and Wicked Lab partnership. It was looking at three suburbs in the city of Marion, and the problem, we were hoping it was going to be climate change, but that kind of like got watered down. But the problem that was identified was the grey concrete suburbs with lack of trees and hot and dry, and this needing for greening for these three suburbs. There is a really cool video that the state government produced that is in cartoon form on the need to take a complexity approach, which I reckon I've looked at that around 500 times in the first couple of weeks, just in disbelief that a state government would produce that video. So that was just amazing. But they took a systems approach for this project. This is the final report on the left and their transition card, which is shown in the report. There was a few hiccups with the project, mainly COVID happening, like that kind of like really, and it was the early days of COVID happening with this project. The project was time limited. And the other thing is there was this restructure of the government agency as well. So it started off with a resource management board, a natural resource management board, and then it moved into this government agency with a change of government to Green Adelaide. So it had to be wrapped up quicker than it was. So it didn't, even though it was a systemic innovation lab, it didn't do all the processes of it. But there were some really interesting findings. One of them was, before I get to the findings, there was a few things we ran alongside this. Because we had state government and local government in the room for this project, and we were starting to get asked for the software to be used for measuring systems change. So I ran a workshop with state government and local government folk and said, would this be enough for you to use with your superiors to say, hey, have a look, we've created systems change. And it got into this discussion about the transition card for our software and how it was very static. And they said what they would really like is something more like that obesity map to show their superiors. And they wanted the wow factor. They wanted to say, hey, this is how complex this is. And they wanted something that had this wow factor. And I said, okay, what would this new feature need? And they said, it doesn't matter. It's just got to have this wow factor. So it didn't matter. So it didn't even matter if it could do anything. So anyway, we developed this ecosystem map, which is the organisations and the edges are the initiatives that the organisations are working on. And it has got a couple of features in it. So it's got between a centrality metric for information flows and stuff like that, but pretty basic, because these tools are used, they're not used by people looking in at the community, but they've been developed so that the community can use them themselves. And the tools don't do anything magical, but they enable people to visualize the dynamics in the system. This whole measurement stuff, working with having the state government and local government players, went into a whole lot about how do we do the measurement to report up, and was measuring transitions enough, which is the top right-hand corner. And they said, it's too early. Like, you know, you just freak people out if you just go in there and expect them to measure transitions. We need to still do the outcomes and the outputs and everything down the bottom part of this matrix. And also look at some of the key targets as well. So develop this matrix, published another paper on measurement, and this one was with the Journal of Strategic Innovation and Sustainability. Now getting back to Green Marion and the actual project, a key finding was the lack of community initiatives in this project. They were all from the state government and the local government, and there was this real lack of community-driven projects. And so a recommendation in the final report was to support initiatives that simultaneously deliver urban greening outcomes and system functionality. So wanting both. They wanted to create the systems change with the initiatives, but they needed to create the initiatives as well, which took us back to the, you know, you can kind of get caught up in the need for the systems change, but what are you changing? And you need to have these initiatives on the ground as well. So we proposed a new program, a systemic, a challenge lab, where people would create nature-based solutions, nature-based enterprises for this Greening Marion project. And I have another social enterprise that focuses on, it's got a program for system social entrepreneurs. So we were pitching the idea of bringing that together, using the ecosystem mapping feature of Wicked Lab software, a mentoring program, bringing in the leaders of the space, and also providing some funding through participatory budgeting. We never got it up, but it got recorded in the final report, and it was actually included as an appendix in the report. And then last year, with the change in the structure of this government, looking at future work plan, one of their key areas is to strengthen and build a movement of nature-based social entrepreneurs who can show the economic value of protecting nature. And I've got a workshop with local government on this space in November. So I guess part of it is don't give up, just keep going because things do turn. The third case study is the South Australian Disaster Resilience Strategy, which is a state government strategy, and they're using the software to support funding. So they've got a grants program, a community grants program, and they have entered all of the initiatives that have been funded by the grants program and looking at how they're checking them off against these characteristics. And it really has made us think about transformation capital and the similarities with that. So where transformation capital is looking at investors deploying capital in a way to change a system's dynamics, this particular strategy is using government funding for that aim. And where transformation capital is looking at impact assessment focused on indicators of transition dynamics, this particular funding source is looking at the characteristics from systems dynamics from Wicked Lab's model. The final case study I'm taking you through is Moving Feast, which is just the most amazing initiative that is happening in Australia. The focus currently, it's a thematic network of social enterprises. The focus now is on a fair, regenerative and connected food system in Victoria. Its birth story, though, was when we had the lockdown. You might have seen it on the news. It made the international news in Australia and Victoria. They locked down these social housing towers with the people in, gave the people very little notice. They didn't have the food in, and they were locked in there for a couple of weeks because of COVID. Even though the government started to bring food to them, it wasn't culturally appropriate. So the social enterprise sector self-mobilised, and we had social enterprises that were growing food, that were cooking food, and that were distributing food coming together to take up this. And they formed a very close thematic network around food that's gone on to this broader mission now. And so this is the makeup for year one from Moving Feast. You've got 8 key social enterprises, and these are using our software, and they've done the ecosystem mapping program. 10 support social enterprises, 7 support organisations, 25 funders. The funders in Australia, especially in philanthropy, are just eating up supporting systems change, which is really quite exciting. 30 plus organisations as well, this ecosystem that is actually shifting the system in Victoria. What I find really exciting about this, putting back my theoretical hat, is that it brings together those 2 systems approaches for social entrepreneurship. You've got these systems aware social enterprises, and they're actually focusing on this transition project, which is just really exciting. Latest developments, nearly there, folk. So the latest developments for us, Marion Mazzucato's work. So looking at, especially seeing the need in the Greening Marion project to focus on the initiatives, looking at what's happening with social enterprises, with Moving Feast, this idea of focusing on these thematic networks of social enterprises and initiatives, and where we've been focused on them jumping over to try to address wicked problems. Marion Mazzucato talks about grand challenges, but highlights they are wicked. So grand challenges, wicked problems, you're in the same space there. And she talks about how they're often represented as SDGs. So we've been thinking about SDGs, clusters of initiatives, going after targeted missions. So we've always kept away from this idea of bringing targets into a complexity approach and starting to do that kind of measurement. But we've also had another thing that was going around in my head at the same time. In Australia, we're developing a national social enterprise strategy because the social enterprise sector and the funders are eating up the systems approach. The strategy is taking a mission-led and system-led approach informed by Marion Mazzucato going after the SDGs. So I had all this going around in my head. And then thought about the structure of our software and how we've got these transition cards, checking off these characteristics for systems change. Couldn't we also check off targets for SDG targets? So there we go. So we've taken that structure from the software and used it for this. And then looking at our ecosystem map, there is this amazing map by LeBlanc in 2015. It recognises that the targets and the SDGs, you've got 2 types there. You've got means of implementation targets and goals, and you've also got thematic area covered, the problem stuff. And so 16 of the 17 SDGs are problem focused, and 107 of the 169 targets are this thematic problem focus. So what we've created is a thematic SDGs network map where you've got the targets, the thematic targets related to the SDG goal, but also showing where that target is actually influences other goals as well. So you could use that for analysis to like stretch your mission, or also to have a think about unforeseen consequences from your work. And we're just about to pilot this with a mining company in Australia, with a large mining company who is mining copper, which is needed for green industries. And so they've got an innovation incubator set up for looking at cleaning up the mining industry. Another area of working on is entrepreneurial ecosystems. So we've been focusing on solution ecosystems. How do we pick all this up and move it over to focus on entrepreneurial ecosystems? And all the research says exactly the same issue. You're actually just focusing on the bits and not the interrelationships between the bits in entrepreneurial ecosystems. And it can result in two key problems, which is one, this feeling that you can actually control these entrepreneurial ecosystems and you can't. And also there's this more of everything problem, where there's this idea that if you get another incubator or if you get another training program, that's going to make a difference to your entrepreneurial ecosystem. And you're not thinking about the interconnections and how this all works together. So that's an area for us. The research says, hey, we're talking about complex adaptive systems again. We've got to take a complex adaptive systems approach. And so I've got a book chapter coming out on this, and I think in July, and we're having discussions with regards to using this for entrepreneurial ecosystems. The final one, that government community interface. We've kind of like said, hey, there's these characteristics that governments should be thinking about with regards to working with communities and checking them off. And the theory says we've got to build the capacity of governments to do this work. Well, telling governments they need to be doing this is one thing, but giving them insights on how to do it is another thing. So another piece of work that we're working on is developing a toolkit for governments to do this work and to manage this interface with community systems. And I'm running a workshop in June with government with regards to this toolkit. That is me. Loads of times for questions. Thank you.
That transition card, can you give me a quick idea of what's continuum or continuum in all of those steps?
So you've got these different focus areas. So if you're disrupting, if you're looking for characteristics for initiatives that could be disrupting, it could be something like creating controversy. Is what you're working on, does it create controversy? Does it set like a vision for the future that is different and disrupts it? So they're very quite basic. And there is a paper, if you have like if you go on the Wicked Labs or Community Capacity Builders websites, there's lots of papers. But there's one there on food. And in that food paper, for each of those characteristics, it's got the reference from complex systems leadership theories, so you can see where they come from. A lot of these are really clear, like 4 of the focus areas for that transition part come from Lichtenstein's paper. But what we've kind of like done is dragged out more of the information stuff. So it's really common kind of like what needs to happen for these transition approaches to happen. And there's different for different, you could separate so people could focus on different work to amplify the action, and then to self-organize, bring those bits back together. So they're all kind of characteristics that are very actionable within initiatives. Oh, okay. So this was asking about the transition card and what kinds of things were those characteristics.
I have a question about the portfolio. So I'm curious how you actually built that portfolio, and what is the development stage of the portfolio? And also I'm curious about the funding structure with you. Your organization units, how does it look like?
So the portfolio, as in, oh yeah, so you're asking me curious about the portfolio and the funding structures within the portfolio. And so by the portfolio, you mean like the initiatives in a particular project?
Yeah, you mentioned actually probably 2 of these projects that you are creating portfolio for a city government based on what they actually want to achieve what it intends?
So just relaying the question again about that I mentioned that there was creating a portfolio. We don't actually do any of the creation of like what the project is. So an example of how we work is either somebody comes onto a project or they do a team of people who are going to work on a systemic innovation lab, and then they go through a process of identifying what is the place they're focused on, the geographical boundary, and what is the wicked problem they're focusing on. And then they go out and identify the initiatives within that boundary. The couple of projects that I did mention where there isn't the initiatives, it was just how do we support for, if someone's doing a project and there isn't the initiatives, what sorts of things could we do to encourage the initiatives to come from the bottom up? So that's the one where we're only actually putting our hands forward to actually help create initiatives within those solution ecosystems.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very stimulating how you move from theory and to examples all the time. So I do have a question about actually similar to your reflection from the last one. So I understand that the lab, the approach is very much supporting this kind of early stage when you help people to create a new mindset and perspective and systemic perspective, and the tools are very useful to create this kind of understanding and also mapping the initiative from a different perspective. And then at early stage, and I think this is also part of your research insight, you have this kind of measuring and monitoring element. But my question is, what about in between, in terms of your own curiosity about the type of process about maintaining support, and even last session we talked about institutionalize some changes over time. Is there something in your lab that is trying to support the kind of the maturity of those initiatives during the implementation? And if there is something or not, what is your approach about transition management approach and strategic niche management that actually covers that perspective about nurturing and supporting niche over time?
Very interesting question. So the question was really looking at the approach we're taking, which is quite hands-off, and are we thinking about doing something that's more hands-on to support this? And up until now, we haven't. We have been really hands-off. But then we'll get phone calls from people, you know, it's been really interesting with regards to the kind of issues that are being addressed. So food is huge. Anything where they've already kind of like taken an ecosystem approach, you know, they're kind of like halfway there because of the nature of what they're working on. So we'll get phone calls from like Greening Marion wants to talk to Western Australia because they, you know, we'd like to learn from what they did with the lab sort of stuff. And so we've kind of like just done up until now the connections of like, yeah, well, you know, are you okay if you get a phone call from these people because they're doing a similar project? But we're just about to employ a community manager that is going to bring the different communities together so that they can learn from each other. We do offer, because we work on like phone call on tap sort of stuff in the early stages. So we do offer mentoring, so people can buy blocks of mentoring sort of stuff. But now we're kind of like handing it over to so that we can actually connect up the communities that are taking up this approach. I think that Indy kind of like said it yesterday, that someone mentioned about the more hands-on kind of work, and Indy said that's really important work, but that's not my thing. And I'm the same, like the whole weaving stuff is just brilliant, but it's not what I do. So we really need to bring in expertise to do that.
Yeah, that was great. I really appreciated the presentation, and particularly the utility of it in so many different areas. On one of your slides towards the end, there was what looked like a pretty big gap in terms of functionality. I think it was on the light green side. And I wondered if there were any insights gained from that. Were there any additional initiatives that were put in place to address those gaps? Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, so the transition cards do highlight gaps. So the question was about, sorry, I'll get there eventually. So the question was about one of the transition cards highlighted a load of gaps in the green area, and what happened with that highlighting of gaps and whether that was addressed. And so the transition cards do highlight gaps. And some users of the transition cards will see those gaps and say, okay, that's where we're going to focus on. So come together as a large community, maybe even do action plans for each of the initiatives with what's been said previously. And they start with that and then they address them. And that was very much the case in that first case study with Edith Cowan University. Other case studies will look at the gaps, but for some other reason, don't focus there and say, no, let's take it easy. Let's spend some time doing more disruption or something. The transition card is a communication tool for that community. I always think of it like a SWOT analysis. Just because something says something doesn't mean that's where you go. It's the start of the discussions. So there isn't really, you know, it isn't like this card shows this, so now you have, it's just like, okay, you've got all that information, now what are you going to do with it? And there'll be different reasons why people will take the decision to go with what's showing, and there might be other reasons why they don't. And even with some of the characteristics, there could be reasons why people don't want those characteristics in their communities. Like the create controversy is not a big thing for government, know what I mean? They're not overly keen on that one. So they might use other kind of characteristics for disrupting. So it's not a magic tool with an algorithm or anything like that. It's just for managing information.
Yeah, hi. Pretty excited. I've always been excited about the possibility of software and linking software to social media as a way to capture some of the complexity and the dynamic perspective shifting, etc. So I'm really excited to see that you have software, but any software measurement tool is only as good as the quality of the data that goes into it. So my question to you is, how are you, so you know, these charts look amazing, but how are you capturing the sort of emergent data and the relationships and the perspectives and the dynamism of all these things, and you know, how is that all inputting into this software?
Oh, I wish Emily was here. She said, like, my co-founder's favourite saying is, it all depends. So the question is, like, with regards to the putting the data in, like, you know, entering the data in, and how we're capturing all the dynamics, and you know, the quality of the data. Like, it's only as good as what the data you put in. So over time, we've learned, you know, to explain. So there's kind of like a, you know, because you're entering the data in, but there's the ticking off that it's got the characteristics, and then an explanation of how it's got that characteristic, and a bit of a template, so you're capturing what needs to happen, so that, and then you can code like who entered the data, so that you're keeping that, and you can develop protocols as a team for using it. So over time, we've kind of like learnt this need to, you know, it is only as good as the data going in. So this need for rigor, this need for understanding, to be able to go back and ask people, you know, who's put the data in, to even the people who've asked the interview questions, to be able to put that into the software so people can go back. And so there is this kind of like emphasis on getting good data into the system, and this realization, and it's part of our training programs as well. Hello, you.
Sorry, Sharon, this isn't going to be an easy question because it's just a comment. Thank you so much, though. I'm currently running a project that is actually using the Wicked Lab tool, and it is amazing. I cannot recommend it enough. We're using it with a mixed group with representatives from district and town council, citizens advice, voluntary action, race equality, members of the community, somebody from social enterprise, and the conversations and meetings just around deciding what's the problem, wicked problem opportunity we're looking at.
are some of the most, well, they are the most useful meetings I have ever been in discussions with council and community. Then deciding what counts as an initiative was a huge thing. It just generates the right kind of conversations. With the funding we've got, we have to do an innovation plan, and I'm intending to use it. We're using it around race equality. The councils have just declared themselves anti-racist councils and are just generating policy. And what we're going to do is we're going to use it to actually design the initiatives, because as you follow along the characteristics, each question gives you something really valuable. It sets each discussion. It's also extremely useful for justifying what you're doing. I'm very good at the surfacing conflict card, but when problems arise, you can actually point to, no, this is all good. We're surfacing conflict. That's an important stage in the process.
Thank you so much, Alison. So Alison and Ian are in the UK and are using the software, and the comments that are made with regards to how they're using the software made me think about some of. So to start off with, the software was only used, it was getting you tick off if you'd actually have that initiative if you'd have that characteristic in an initiative, but now you can tick off that an initiative has got that characteristic. You can tick off that you're planning to have that characteristic, and you can tick off like you want further information, and you can tick, so there's a whole lot of different pull downs you can have with regards to the kind of information that you can gather as well, and it shows up in the transition card, definitely. So we've just been on one massive learning journey, and I can't believe I actually earn a living from just playing in this sandpit.
Well done, Sharon. It's an amazing, piece of work, history of work, and you can really see that experience from going from research into practice and how that's producing really rigorous practice. So it's really great to see. I think my question builds on the last comment, and I was pleased to see that conflict, surfacing conflict in there is one of the points you're looking for. And my question is, in that community government interface, you are going to surface a lot of conflict about what people want and what the priority is. So in terms of the process, how do you manage that? And how do you actually make decisions about what's in and out? And who gets to decide? And I just, my ears kind of pricked up when you said about the Reading Marion initiative. And you said, well, they were going to work on sustainability, but they ended up reading the suburbs. So I just thought, how did that come about? There might be a bit of a story there. So.
Yeah, I think working with government, you always get those stories. I remember when we were, so the questions were with regards to really, I guess, drawing on a couple of insights from watching the presentation, and the working with government and the conflict from working with government, and how do you manage that, and also I guess being intuitive to some of the underlying stories with some of what I presented, and I think I always remember that they're complex social policy problems, and I've come from the PhD research was about active citizenship and watching citizens being stopped from progressing what they were doing because of coming up against all these power walls. I also have a background in urban regeneration, and worked on an amazing project with community, where the community came up with all these ideas and self-organised and started developing initiatives. And I was working for the government at the stage, and I got trampled on. Like, the government didn't want the community to go where they wanted to go. And so all of my bosses got pulled into offices without me into meetings, and, you got car taken away, phone taken away, had to CC bosses, in emails, sort of stuff, like really in trouble. Like, I thought it was my last job, I reckon. And so I know how heavy it can come down when it doesn't go government's way. But also I know that I don't want to be working and supporting initiatives that aren't part of the main game. I don't want to be working working on community initiatives over here that are underpinning that engagement part are really important. So it's Lipsky's street level bureaucracy. Know what I mean? So this recognition that governments, people working in governments aren't stopping this from happening because they're assholes. They're stopping it from happening because there's all of these systems behind them that are telling them they've got to work this way. So how do we recognize the systems of the workers, of those frontline government workers? And how do we actually highlight that these are the things that need to change? And so all of those characteristics are along those lines. Also soft power, you know what I mean? So it's about creating, wanting citizens to address these issues that governments want to address, but doing it in a way that is attracting people because of their work practices. So, so those characteristics at the interface are very much about making it more enticing for citizens to work this way because they're genuinely being appreciated for what they contribute.
Oh, no, there you go. Is it very clear? Because Jess is already looking at it.
So back to theory. So I appreciate now that the tool also inspires you to ask questions. I was just wondering if you've mapped in leverage points from Meadows, and also potentially systems thinking heuristics from system change or Walter's Foundation, because they provide heuristics on how to appreciate and deal with systems.
So it's purely complex systems leadership theory. So for those transitions, it's purely from those 4 complex systems leadership theories. So it kind of like took that transition process and just mined those papers to actually get those characteristics. So it's very much a celebration of what social entrepreneurship has to offer in this space. I would say that the diverse, because I think what's different about social entrepreneurship is the whole focus is on the problem. So it's very pragmatic with regards to the problem. So there's no room for fluff.